This gets me in trouble a little bit. Living as a man is difficult in some ways and easy in some ways, I think, relative to the other options on the table. And one of the ways in which I think it's difficult is that we have an inconsistent idea of what it means to be a man in the modern world. Howdy, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Nice to meet you, Vaush. How you doing? Thanks so much for having me, and thanks so much for revisiting a kind of an old take here that I wanted to ask you about how the left responds or doesn't to people like Andrew Tate and the so-called Manosphere. I'm excited to get into this.
Oh yeah, the pleasure is properly mine.
Yeah, so for people who don't know, I'm coming from a podcast called Darts and Letters, which looks at sort of academia and intellectual culture from a left perspective. And so we sometimes look at these kind of pseudo-intellectual spaces, but also look at how scholars and academics and others have sort of come to understand them. And I was just kind of like really interested in this take you had like back in January about how the left was basically completely forgoing the troubles of young men and like letting them sort of into the arms of the right. What's happened since then? By the way, I checked on your Twitter feed and whatnot. Have you kind of engaged in that since then, or have people come back at you since then?
Well, it's been quieter for a while because Andrew Tate is, of course, in prison, and he's also earned a lot more public ridicule for being in prison and for a bunch of other stuff. The only person I see right now who's really loud, there are only two people, or I guess a group and a person. It's Sneeko, who is mostly a laughingstock, and the Fresh and Fit podcast, which unfortunately I can't cover their segments on stream because they aggressively DMCA people who check their stuff out. So my engagement has been a bit quieter. I think people for the most part have taken more my side, but like not my side, right? I think Sean came out with a video recently which had some stuff to say that was in line with the idea that there's kind of like a sociological push towards those mannerisms, those body politics. But I still think that the left is being quite milquetoast on this. I think we could go a lot further.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I wanted to share with you, like a little anecdote, as a Canadian, there's a sort of episode in Canadian politics that has a weird kind of rhyme to me, and it's like way back in 2013, we had for a long time a right-wing government, and there was a thwarted terror attack, and it was really interesting to see some of the responses to it because you had in this one kind of famous press conference, a journalist asked Stephen Harper, a prime minister at the time, what I thought was a really astute question. She basically said, like, there's this problem of young men who are being radicalized here, and I wonder if it's time to ask what the root causes are of this radicalization. And then Stephen Harper like famously responded, and I'll just kind of read it because I think it's interesting. He said, like, at this moment, it's not the time to commit sociology. These are serious threats. These people have agendas of violence that are deep and abiding threats to our values as a society. I think we only want to convey the view of utter condemnation. And that was sort of it. And then later, one of his people went in and said the cause of terrorism is terrorists. And the like left-wing sociologist types stepped in and like very obviously condemned this as like anti-intellectual, and like we can kind of understand where these people are coming from without ceding like our ideological ground or apologizing for terrorists. Seems kind of obvious, right? But then to see like, okay, 10 years later, now you try to do that and then people attack you. So I was thinking back to this Harper episode and just wondering like how do we get to this point? We're saying, well, let's just try to understand this to like more intelligently fight it is seen as somehow like apologizing for it or just like not a question worth asking.
Well, I think doing that requires a kind of non-essentialist perspective on evil, or at least on bad behavior, which people are uncomfortable with. People like thinking of bad people as being sort of fundamentally, intrinsically, like cosmically bad. in ways that are sort of non-replaceable or transferable. We've had this conversation when it comes to actual, real, like Islamic terrorism, for example. ISIS rose as a response to instability that we produced in the Middle East through our behavior. And of course, this isn't, a coincidence or an accident. This is because people are actually a lot more likely to join far-right terrorist groups if they have nothing to lose and if their family's been blown up by a U.S. drone strike. It makes sense if you think about it for any
Mhm.
length of time. But there's been a long opposition to thinking about things that way in the national defense community. They've taken more to it now. But I remember for a solid,
Yeah.
well over a decade, like you just couldn't talk about it, you know? Why are ISIS bad? Because they're ISIS. Al Qaeda, why are they mad? Oh, well, you can read out what bin Laden wrote when 9/11 happened about Western imperialism. But no. It's because he's bad. They hate us for our freedoms. Um, Obviously, I don't think your average manosphere incel over here in the West is like Boko Haram or Al Qaeda or ISIS or anything else. Though there are similarities in the way in which they're recruited, a feeling of dispossession,
Hmm.
of masculine entitlement to a kind of heroic story that they feel they're no longer a part of, a feeling that they've been emasculated by another institution, or that some kind of sexual or gender narrative has been taken from them, like their right to a woman or to an idyllic life in in a loving family, and they respond to that with very radical and very ineffective solutions, and we need to know what's causing it in order to deal with it.
Mm. Yeah, total parallels. Even like the sociological configurations of like little cells of men kind of reminds me of like pickup artists, right? I mean, they kind of function in a similar way as these like terror cells did. But I don't know if I'm like misremembering this time or like looking at it with rose-colored glasses, but yeah, I definitely remember the pushback of people saying like we don't need to understand why terrorists are the way that they are. They're just evil. But like with the reaction to this Harper quote, like I seem to remember all of the lefty sociologists like really holding their ground and saying like, understanding the causes isn't like forgiving it, but now I don't see as many people making those kinds of claims about like manosphere people, except for like maybe you and a few others. Like it seems like at least the left is like a little bit more cautious of making this kind of intellectual case.
I think it's because it's considered more distasteful. I'm borrowing sort of from the biases that I see in other
Mm,
people on the left. I've seen a lot of people on the left. They're very willing to extend, I would say, an abstract hand of charitability, of reform, of understanding, of reconciliation to people who have done some really bad stuff. We take a look at ISIS, and I don't think we have sympathy for ISIS, but I think there's like okay, well, you're a victim of Western imperialism, of these campaigns, your family has been killed. Okay, like, I do not agree with what you have done, but I understand, and there's something intellectual about that. You feel smarter than, say, the US federal government. But we're less likely to extend that kind of charitability to people who engage in relatively petty and much more personal kinds of harm against us. For example, I don't think most people would be willing to think of that as a guy they meet at a party who's callous and sexist towards them. If there's like a chick and meets a guy and the guy's just really rude to her and obviously sexist, I don't think the woman's going to go away from that thinking, oh, well, I don't agree with his behavior, but, I do sort of respect and have awareness of the sociological conditions that blah, blah, blah. No, because it just happened. It happened to you.
mhm,
It was right there. And he was mean and he was sexist. And you're not going to like sociologize that. And the manosphere stuff touches on patterns of behavior that we do see and experience every moment of our lives, pretty much, when we go
yeah.
online and deal with these people. I don't talk to ISIS radicals online, but I do talk to a lot of lonely guys who have decided to take it out on women. That proximity, I think, makes
Yeah.
us weirdly, counterintuitively, less sympathetic.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like kind of a tougher ask for someone to say, like, in principle, yes, I will think we should sociologically understand terrorists. And like, yes, I think you should be like affording all of this extraordinary sympathy to people that are like sexist to you, especially when they show like no sympathy towards other people around them, poor and marginalized and racialized communities, to say like, afford them the kind of humanity that they're not affording other people. Like that's the tough ask, right?
It's also a matter of perceived triviality, of course. Western imperialism, bombs, drones, those are big deals, you know?
Yeah.
Hundreds of billions spent on war. But for a lot of these guys, they're just virgins and mad about it. Now,
Yeah.
now I want to be clear, by the way. Obviously, when we're talking about what motivates people to their behavior, this is like a descriptive um, undertaking. If you think a cause is trivial, you can think that. That doesn't alleviate our need to understand why it's happening. You know, the pettiest things, a little pebble in your shoe can cause you to tumble off a cliff, right? You don't stop at analyzing a problem because it seems minor. And while it is certainly the case that it is probably better to be an 18-year-old virgin than it is to be killed in a drone strike, I don't have the exact numbers on that, but I think that's the case. Um, you know, in the minds of people who are going through problems we consider trivial, there is like a monster there, right? Like to people who really care about being an incel or about like being waylaid or feeling hopeless when it comes to women, that weighs on them, and it weighs on them a lot. And obviously, when it comes to the extent to which these problems affect their mental state, you know, if we see a consistent, disproportional, outsized effect on people's behavior based on what we consider relatively minor initial circumstances, well, then obviously, by definition, they're not minor. Clearly, then it's actually major. It just seems minor to us because we're not in that headspace, and we should treat it as though it is.
Mm. Yeah, that's a point well taken. It's not really about sort of like ranking people's the lived experience or the feeling of oppression and saying, well, this one is more worthwhile and this one is less worthwhile, therefore we should ignore. Like ideally, we should be trying to like alleviate everyone's anxieties and loneliness and their economic dislocation and all the other forces that are oppressing them. Um, I guess one of the questions I had was like, why you? Why have you made this? I don't want to say that you're like the spokesman of this take. There are other people that say things like this. But when I started to look for other lefties that made what I think is a pretty like self-evident, like obvious claim that we should try to understand these people to like better fight against this kind of ideology, I didn't find that many people making the claim. So I was curious as to why you found yourself here.
I think a lot of people on the left consider it kind of passe because you are they see it as a kind of legitimization, where by
Hmm.
catering to their interests or trying to understand them, you're sort of placating or legitimizing them in some way, which I completely disagree with. You know, I no more than I would think you're legitimizing like fundamentalist Islamic terrorism by making an effort to sort of alleviate the conditions by which it arises or understand how it is. You know, I think that's nonsensical. Um, and I also think there's a difficulty because this gets me in trouble a little bit, but okay, living as a man is difficult in some ways and easy in some ways, I think, relative to the other options on the table. And one of the ways in which I think it's difficult is that we have an inconsistent idea of what it means to be a man in the modern world. We have a traditional understanding, which is, of course, very patriarchal, very authoritarian, very, like strong, silent, keep your emotions in, that kind of stuff, you know. And then we have a more like modern interpretation of what it means to be a man, which is to deviate from those behaviors in some but not all ways. We still like it when men are big and strong. Hegemonically, culturally, interpersonally, that is still a popular trait. Assertiveness is considered attractive, but assertiveness in the wrong way is considered creepy. A lot of guys fear being called creepy over stuff that I think a lot of
Hmm.
women get away with easily because people don't see a innate social threat with women's behavior, at least not often. And all of this together, I think, means that a lot of people are having a kind of crisis of identity. And there are not many roads out of this. You see the Manosphere road, where it's like, a society hates you, feminism has ruined women, and the only way to overcome this is to focus on the grind, focus on, don't care about women, make money, whatever. Not a good idea, I think, for the mental health in the long run. And a lot of these people, they're not going to make money just because you tell them to. This doesn't solve their problems. But a lot of the lefties' attitudes towards this is like well, you'll be more happy if you just check your privilege, reconcile the problematic aspects of your behavior, and sort of detoxify yourself, get rid of the toxic masculinity. This is incredibly patronizing, obviously. First of all, the introspection required to just take negative parts of your personality and twist them off, this is an incredibly difficult task, even for people who have, like, that's like a lifelong thing. We are both
Hmm.
the sculptor and the sculpture. It hurts to change yourself. Um, And it also doesn't immediately solve anyone's problems. Being less toxically masculine doesn't make you more confident, make you more happy with yourself. It maybe means you're less likely to lash out at yourself and others when certain conditions take place, but it's possible that for a lot of these guys, anger is actually a cathartic outlet, in which case simply removing that actually creates more problems to their mental
Hmm.
health and makes them feel like they have no outlet. The solution is synthesis. You have to find ways to promote positive masculinity, not just talk down the toxic elements. And the left struggles with this because I think a lot of them consider it beneath them to have to give instruction on how men ought to behave in a way that is actually useful.
Mm. I think another part of the problem is, and what I think you captured so well in a bunch of series of tweets is like, just the fact of reminding people that like the people that we're really talking about here are not like weird crypto fascists. They are essentially like 14, 15, 16-year olds who are seeing stuff on like TikTok. And I can't remember where it was you said it, but it's just like these are not Bond villains. These are just like confused people with some bad ideas about what masculinity is, and we can sort of counsel them through that, right? Like why the invocation to like make them into this like dangerous straw man. It's like the teenager is standing in for all of the sins of patriarchy.
Yeah, and the average person who falls into this stuff is not even aware of the conditions that they're responding to or creating. People get
Hmm.
into reactionary movements not because they want to be the domineering victors, but because they think they're victims. Look at the language behind literally every reactionary movement
Yeah.
ever, ever. Even when to go as far as we can, the Nazis were at the apex of their power. You go listen to one there, the other speech, and interspersed between the, glory of the fatherland or whatever, is crying and whinging about how they're victimized by international Judaism. These reactionary movements, they cannot operate without the victim complex because the feeling of grievance is what drives them
Yeah.
towards these perceived solutions. So, the idea that these people are just like Machiavellians who are choosing to be sexist because they think they benefit from that power arrangement. No, they don't.
Mm.
No, they don't. And also, no, they do not. They don't benefit from it. No more so than the white man benefits from white supremacy. He may be better off than the people he mistreats, but in fact, the life of many white people was made worse because the systems of slavery and labor exploitation, the institution of the police, which grew out of, slave patrols, these institutions are recursive. They hurt people who are not just of a different race, but of lower stature, of lower power. And race is not the only power hierarchy in our society. There's also class. There's also health. There's mental health. There's a lot of stuff that intersects. People do not, in the long run, benefit from systems designed to hurt those other than them. Um, or perhaps maybe a very tiny minority of people on top. The population at large, certainly. So I reject the idea that there is any Machiavellian self-interested intent here. I think people are sad and desperate and lonely. And being young people mostly, they're impressionable. And I think it's our responsibility to give them a narrative that contradicts the one that they seem to keep falling into.
Mm. What exactly does that look like for a left? Like, how do we sort of speak to these issues without like ceding any kind of ideological ground and sticking to the principles? Because we're not talking here about like abandoning feminism
No.
or anything like that. We're just talking about like speaking to a people before that they go down the rabbit hole of like far right manosphere bros.
Oh, the main thing I think you need is to teach confidence and self-reliance in ways that are actually positive. And the thing that's difficult about teaching confidence, this is pickup artistry fundamentally. I have talked on stream before. Oh, if you're at a party, here are some ideas maybe on how you can approach these conversations. But the critical difference, is that you don't want to foster the development of a kind of like checklist to run through. You
Mm.
want to give people basic tools um to respect the people they're talking to enough that they know when what they're doing is getting them social accolades, when they're doing something that is being received positively. And if you can get people to understand when that's happening, I think that's the bedrock upon which everything is built. Because I'll tell you, I don't know if you've ever struggled with like a lack of social confidence. I haven't, but I've heard from other people. The main thing that gets them is the idea they're in a social event, they're talking to somebody, and they feel like that other person just wants to leave the conversation. They're like inside, they're talking about this, that, the other, and inside they're thinking, oh God, they just want me to stop talking. You become apologetic. You sort of stutter in your speech because you're like sort of pausing for their signal. You're sabotaging yourself because
Mhm.
you're not putting your best foot forward now. You're waiting for them to take a step away, and in doing so, you're giving them an excuse to. It's not good. And teaching people like how to move from that, how to be better than that. I think that's literally like step one. A lot of these guys in the manosphere can't even talk to women. They're terrified of them.
That is so true. That is so true. I wanted to ask you a little bit. I don't know if this is exactly pushing back, but one of the questions I had in seeing some of your takes is like, can this be veering a little too far into left bashing? And I say that because in this episode that I'm producing, we also are talking to folks with QAnon Anonymous who are doing this series on the Man Clan, and I talked to Annie Kelly, and I sort of said, what should the left do? And she's like, yeah, that's all a good point. But actually, I think maybe the left is like, I mean, the right is talking to these people, but like the left is too, right? Like the liberal center is like completely ignoring this and, wanting to deplatform it. And that's the extent of it. But she said, like, when she was doing her PhD talking to all these like far right manosphere people, every time she ran into somebody who had left the movement, they were essentially a socialist. And they had a story about someone on the left talking to them. And so she came to the conclusion, I actually think we are actually doing a little bit, maybe not enough, but we're doing stuff.
I don't think there's a total absence from the left in terms of responding to it. I think that there are 2 points to this. I think one of them is that there is on the left an assumption that the only way to get these guys out of the position that they're in is to move them over to another radical ideology to fill the same hole in their chest that the Manosphere stuff did.
Mm,
Socialism is a wonderful thing. I believe in it. But I know a lot of people use radical ideologies as a way of giving themselves a drive and a purpose, to distinguish themselves from others, to give them a sense of identity. This isn't necessarily bad, but it's also not the same as fixing the initial problems. It's just giving them a
right.
different set of tools to cope with them. I think that this is useful in tandem with other things. I think, personally, that people will gravitate towards positive ideologies if they start with a healthy mindset. If on a fundamental level, you give them the tools to engage appropriately with their social setting, I think they're more likely to make those positive decisions. They're less likely to fall down the bad rabbit holes. And I'm interested in seeing, because you take a 14-year-old white boy on a playground, right? Terrified of women, a lot of them, right? Like this is the thing, puberty. But now we're all listening to, internet self-help coaches. I mean, people are more susceptible than ever to extremely well-produced propaganda selling them ideologies based on this, that, the other. And I notice a lot of young people who get into socialism and do it out of a kind of contrarianism. Whatever, we
Right.
all start somewhere. But that's not the reason why people get into the manosphere stuff. It's not to be contrarian. It's because there's a deep underlying anxiety about them and their relationship with women. And I think that specifically needs to be targeted, not just through here's another thing that can give your life meaning, but through these ideas should be at the face of it, they should be ridiculous.
Mm.
To you, you should see this and you should think, this does not work for me. This is a ridiculous set of solutions because I have this. And the this I want them to have is confidence, is social skills.
That's interesting. So if I hear you correctly, like we should be starting like basically just at the level of like pro-social self-help, essentially, like how to just navigate as a young person who's a bit socially awkward and can't quite fit in, and not like the level of sort of structural explanation, right? Because you could construct a kind of socialist answer to this, which I tend to do. It's like, okay, you're feeling this kind of economic anxiety and dislocation because the sort of male breadwinner role that used to exist no longer is an option for you, and we're just trying to reckon with that kind of wreckage. So you can kind of point to structure, whereas you're saying point to like just the like, can they navigate their social world?
Yeah, I don't think a person should need to have like like a socialist critical theory perspective on their own anxieties in order to overcome or
Mm,
alleviate them. A lot of young people aren't going to become radicals, and I think that's fine, as long as they don't go down the worst roads they could possibly take. Ideally, you would hit them with both. But there are a
right.
lot, and I don't mean to besmirch here, but there are a lot of people on the left who are kind of miserable because as it turns out, having good politics has nothing to do with living a fulfilling life. They're actually completely separate things. There are neo-Nazis who live fulfilling lives. Not many, I'll admit. Those people generally are doing pretty poorly. And there are communists and socialists who are living terrible lives because politically they're on the ball. But that doesn't give them the skills
Right.
to talk to people or to order their lives in an appropriate way. Jordan Peterson got famous, right? I mean, with his self-help stuff, which was laden, of course, with conservative propaganda. But at its face, it was about self-help. And understanding from a critical perspective why you feel the way you do is not the same as not feeling that way. I think it's better to say to this person, you know, here's how you alleviate your anxiety, than to
Mhm.
say this is why you're feeling that way. Not only because most people aren't just aren't that introspective to begin with. It takes time, I think, in education for many to get to that point, but also because that feeling is the core of their response, not their
Right.
lack of an understanding of it.
Hmm. I see your point. I think one of the tensions this has came up for me every single time I talk to other lefties about self-help. The kind of stock answer is that I'm not really sure there's a way to do it in a pro-social way because it has like an individuating aspect where like even in this conversation we're talking about like people and their inner world and how they like learn to navigate as individuals on the playground or whatever. And I worry like is there a tension there? Are we actually if we don't forefront, maybe not forefront, but at least include very quickly that kind of structural answer, we end up with like a new kind of just like lefty-ish Jordan Peterson, but it's still a manual. It's just 12 different rules.
Well, I think you get a kind of political doomerism where
Mm.
people are, you know, they have an ideology that I might agree with, but their attitude towards it is one of a kind of defeatist, the world is bad because of these reasons, and I am just sort of sleepwalking through it. I mean, we saw a lot of that back during the 2020 election, I think, especially after Bernie dropped out, where a lot of people's adherence to leftism seems to be an abstract, like, sit from the sidelines, you know, crow when things are going poorly and cheer when they're going well, but it doesn't seem to order their lives very much. And I disagree with the idea that self-help is very individualized.
Mm.
I actually think this is a really negative leftist tendency, or progressive tendency maybe, or maybe it's just a tendency. The idea that, well, different things work differently for everyone. That's not true. There are a lot of things that work perfectly well for everyone, and most people don't do it. Exercise, properly regulating their diet and sleep schedule, making sure they go outside and get some vitamin D, doing their best to go to in real life, in person social events and speak occasionally with people in a
Hmm.
non customer service setting. These are objective bits of advice. There are very few exceptions to them, and most people don't do them. It's like
Yeah.
it's this is why like talking with doctors is frustrating, right? You go to a doctor and you talk with them about your sleep issues, and the doctor will be like, "Okay, what's your sleep schedule?" And you'll be like, "What? My what? My what?" And then it's like, well, they can't help you with any kind of medicine if there might be like 17 basic physiological things you're messing up with. Do you do any exercise? What? Do you go outside? What? Like, so I I think that basic lessons on confidence, social engagement for young men, I think have almost universal applicability. Obviously, there are some cases where there's some like much deeper specific thing, but man, if you could target, you know, 90% of people with a given social anxiety, I'd say that's a pretty huge portion if the Manosphere is turning out millions of supporters.
No kidding. Yeah. As a veritable self-hating leftist who can't get up on time, I think this is
Same.
all a good advice I should heed. I wanted to go back to kind of like the left responsibility and maybe make like a bit of a finer point on that. Like who in particular is responsible? And I have in mind especially like seeing some women respond to the feed and like there's like obviously like people that are essentially like denying their existence or are like rank sexists, we shouldn't really expect women to be the one showing that sort of humanity and carefully sociologizing their history. Like, are we asking men to take this kind of responsibility to talk to other men? Are we talking asking women as well, or everyone? How do we go about not sort of like putting an unrealistic expectation or a kind of pushing someone into a very odious circumstances as well?
I think people should do it if they feel they can do a good job, and overwhelmingly men will be the ones who can do a better job. Not because their arguments are better, because the kinds of people that we're talking to will feel talked down to if a woman is the one giving them advice. I know for a fact that when I was 14, 15, and if a woman, twice my age had been like, "Hey, listen, here are some things you can do to be better with," I wouldn't have listened to her. I mean, why would I be expected to? No matter how much life experience she has. Well, I suppose she could have been in my shoes at some point, but she probably hasn't been. Um, I think that it's something that you should go for if you think you can. Well, I don't think people have a responsibility to pursue this kind of rhetoric if they don't have a hand on it. I do think they have a responsibility to not hamper others when they pursue that rhetoric, which is what I've seen a lot of. When I get my hot
Right.
takes on Twitter, I get people who are accusing me of being a rape apologist for saying that we should like try to talk to incels or that I hate women or whatever. Unfortunately, I get in trouble for saying this too, but it's unfortunately true, and I refuse to let the deep state silence me. There are a lot of people who just hate men on the left. That hate is not very socially consequential in the long term. It's certainly not an institutional force like patriarchy, white supremacy, whatever else, but it exists and it clouds people's judgment. Men are, after all, very annoying. If you've ever been on Grindr, and I have, and if you've dated men, and I have, you would know that. They're quite a hassle to deal with. And interpersonal experiences with men, particularly for victims of sexual assault by men, I think often have a predisposition towards wariness towards them. I don't
Mm.
think that's wrong. I don't think that's unjustifiable. I do think that making political decisions based off of that bias, however, can really it can really hamper an effort to address a serious social problem.
Mm. Yeah, I understand exactly what you're saying. That makes a lot of sense. We can have like an empathy towards that position and understand where it's coming from, just like we're asking about understanding men, but not champion that as like the prevailing leftist attitude as like a political project when we're talking about young boys in the manosphere. So I guess kind of last question, or one or two more questions if you have the time,
I
Vaush.
certainly
So
do.
awesome. So I was watching one of your streams, and I can't remember exactly how you put it, but you asked people in the room. You said, for people that were like in these spaces before, when you were in those spaces, did you wake up in the morning thinking about how you wanted to hate women and dominate them, or were you responding to some kind of lack, some kind of problem in yourself? And overwhelmingly, people said, "No, I wasn't. I was responding to my issue. It wasn't really fundamentally about hating women." And I got to thinking about that, and I was wondering about what kind of. I wanted to hear more about some of the interactions that you've had with your fans and others who might have been in these spaces. What do they say about how they left or why they left?
Well, I think its origin is largely a product of longing, you know. Not to say there aren't incels who hate women, there certainly are. I think the hate is a second order feeling though. I've certainly experienced the emotion of having someone who I had quite a crush on. And I nothing was going to happen there. But the feeling that I had for this person was significant enough that after a while I kind of didn't want to be around them that much because it sort of dominated my mind when I was in their presence. And I feel like that negativity multiplied by it being all women, not just one person, and it being a perceived lifelong thing. Because of course these people, they think this is like forever. They're
Right.
16. They think like, oh, well, I'll never get laid. If I haven't lost my virginity by 16, it's over. It's like, okay. But I mean, tell a 16-year-old that they're wrong, right? You can, and you'd be right to, but they won't listen. Um, and and the way to get out of that in many cases, I think, at least from what I've heard from my community, is that it starts with friendship. When you think of women, I'm speaking mostly here as like the idea of these incels being heterosexual men. There are of course gay or pan incels, but overwhelmingly this is a heterosexual tendency.
Mhm.
Hell, there are femcels. I mean, God, it's a beautiful world out there.
The
But
internet is weird.
oh God, yes. Um, when you see women as a desirable object of affection and only as that, it clouds your ability to engage with them. Because I don't know about you, I've never talked to an object of affection. I talk to people mostly in my job and in my life. And we know how to talk to people. Most do. Even the socially awkward have some idea of how to do it. We're not all, I don't know, Bochi the Rock over here. But you think of a woman as something else entirely, a different category of person, all your social abilities dry up. And instead, they're just this abstract configuration of emotional and sexual feelings that you can't really combine into the shape of a person. But when you can learn to see, it sounds so trite, see women as people, being friends with a woman, right? Women and men are basically the same. Women are also dumb and annoying. They're all dumb and annoying. It's in the same basic ways, really, especially out of high school. Because in high school, the differences get played up because of puberty. But for the most part, people act, basically the same. If you talk to a lot of women, I think, and you talk to them properly as like a friend or as an equal, a lot of them are really relieved because women are so used when talking to men to every guy just secretly trying to sleep with them that they'll make they'll make the crass jokes, they'll let themselves relax, they'll drop their guard a little bit, as people should with friends. And when you see that, and if you're empathetic about it, you understand what it is they actually are, what they represent. I think all this manosphere stuff just becomes unsustainable nonsense. It completely dissipates with the understanding that this categorical distinction is almost entirely non-existent,
Mm.
because that's what it's rooted in, right? The idea that men and women are fundamentally different is necessary to their ideology. That idea cannot, it can't be absent.
Mm.
And yeah, I think that's the main thing you have to tackle. And I think that's what works most. And I see that a lot from my community. It's like, well, I finally had a positive relationship with a woman, and I thought, oh my God, what have I been doing?
I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is like if you think leftists are miserable, these manosphere people, it looks like hell. Like they have they're completely joyless. Like all their kind of social, it's all about social proof and about like competing with other men in a dog eat dog consumerist world in which they can't even have healthy relationships with women because women are simply objects of their status. Like who wants to actually live in that kind of world?
And it's why we need to look happy as well. They
Yes.
they look at Andrew Tate and they think, oh, he's happy. No, Andrew Tate's clearly miserable,
Yeah.
obviously, when you look at him, like any sensible adult. But we also we need to look radiant. And this is one of the reasons why I'm critical of, I don't want to use the term castration here. What's another good one? It's when you demasculate, emasculate. Thank you.
Emasculation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Emasculate. There's an attitude I think that a lot of people on the left have towards men, where they need to like lower the man bit. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
what men are politically as a group is in many cases harmful, they think, and therefore, as there are men everywhere, and there are in my social space and in my house and in my school and blah blah, ideally they would be less that. And this is like one of those contradictions of identity that I was talking about, because in reality, very masculine people are actually universally respected and celebrated. You can say it's because of social bias, and it certainly is, but that is still nonetheless the case. And you can tell, go into a social setting as like a 6'8", really muscular guy with a symmetrical face and a square jaw and a nice haircut, and nobody is going to dislike this. Nobody. Everybody fawns over people like that. In the same way that even on the left, where we're supposedly like critical of, misogyny and sexual exploitation or whatever, if there's a very well endowed woman wearing skimpy clothing, everybody likes this. Funnily, except the incels, they think it's taunting them. The problem isn't with like exaggerated archetypes of masculinity and femininity. I think that those are fun and fine if you adhere to them or not. I think the problem is an expectation of toning down masculine elements can make a lot of guys seem kind of, unhappy and henpecked. I mean, we know the stereotypes on the left, right? That the guys are all like emasculated, they're soy,
Mm.
they're wimps, they're afraid to be charismatic or outspoken. And certainly there's these perceptions can't be entirely dispelled because a lot of them are rooted in an attack on the concept of progressivism itself. But I do think it would be beneficial if there was a more outward celebration of a wider range of presentations within the left.
Mm.
The idea that it's okay to be a super masculine guy, of course, as long as you don't rep these negative traits. We certainly think that way about very feminine women, right? Like, people on the left aren't usually talking down Barbies. The right says we do, but that doesn't actually like happen all that much. And I don't know. It's difficult for me to point at a broader trend here because I'm kind of grasping at the margins of a tendency that I see. But it does seem like a lot of people think that there's the checking your privilege thing comes with like a prerequisite of like you have to tone down the identity a bit. And
Right.
we need to do away with that. I think we need to show that no matter what you're like, as long as what you're like isn't crap, you can be a part of the left and you can be happy and radiant and whoever you want to be. And you can do the kind of like archetypal alpha bro frat jock thing of, being a big kind of muscular dumb guy who just sleeps around a bunch. There's nothing fundamentally toxic about that, I don't think. It's a lovely kind of person to have in your local community. And um yeah, I think I'm rambling a bit at this point.
If you're a good person, fundamentally, like my last question, Vaush, I wonder, is there a risk that someone is listening to me or is listening to you and is saying, like, are we being just like a little too easy on these men, or why are we fixating on these men when, like I was saying earlier, a lot of them like deny the humanity of other less privileged people? Why harp on, the oppressed young boys, most of which are probably middle class or upper middle class, and at the end of the day, even though they're kind of weird now and it's kind of acting out in pathological ways, they'll be fine. So is this really our hill to die on?
Well, I don't think we have the luxury of making that choice. Leaving aside the fact that they're people and they deserve to live happy, fulfilling lives, even if that means that they have to be, some effort has to be expended on them. We're also talking about the bedrock of like the modern far right movement. Andrew Tate went from having essentially no prominence to having a galactic, like international, like leader of the right level of prominence entirely by being a misogynist. That is insane. And people can bemoan the unfairness of having to take this group of people seriously if they want, but that doesn't change the descriptive fact that if we don't, there will continue to be problems, potentially severe ones, after all. Sexually frustrated, identity waylaid young men are, after all, the bedrock of fascism in almost every country where fascist movements have developed. The idea that these 14-year-olds whose politics at that age are entirely rooted in misogyny won't then develop into all of the adjacent things. After all, Andrew Tate, anti-feminism, critique of Western progressivism from the perspective of being a fake Muslim, all of this stuff. It eventually blossoms into broader anti-progressivism, and then from there, we must defend the West against the feminazis, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what happens. We see this happen. It's not even subtle. So we don't have the luxury of ignoring this problem, for one. But for two, also, from a purely humanitarian perspective, a person being white or upper middle class or kind of annoying online doesn't mean they're any less deserving of living a happy life, especially if the way in which they could live a happy life would be to make them less annoying online. They're potentially valuable allies. They're people who deserve to have a good life. And I do feel for a lot of them. Not all of them are Andrew Tate Sims. A lot of these people are just really sad and have no hope that their life will turn out the way that, say, their parents did. They look at their father, and they see their father presumably married and had kids, and they live in a house, a lot of them, especially if they are middle or upper middle class, and they realize that due to changing economic circumstances and social circumstances, they may never have the privilege of getting to live the life that is supposed to be the template archetypal American dream. And people can go in a lot of different directions after that one. But if their primary concern is sexual frustration, a lack of self-confidence, it's likely they're going to go into the Manosphere route. And I just think they deserve better than that. The right has been carving a path for them. They've been carving a slip and slide that they have been, greasing the wheels of. This is a well-manufactured road. And people are the products of their circumstances. You can bemoan the triviality of a 14-year-old's concerns all you want, but if that's the road that was built for them, I think we have an obligation to try our best to build them a better one.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you so much. This has been fantastic, Vaush.
No, I enjoyed the conversation very much. Thank you very much for having me on.
Great. Cheers. All right, I'll let you go, or you'll let me go, I guess.
We'll both let each other go. That's egalitarianism right there. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Take care.
Take
Bye
care.
now.